She was the omega they stepped on for 22 years. The girl who woke before dawn, carried the weight of a pack that despised her and swallowed every cruelty in silence. The one they called worthless. The one they forgot was watching. The one they never once stopped to be afraid of. That was their mistake. Because on the morning the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territory walked through the iron gates of her pack, he did not look at the powerful wolves lined up to impress him. He looked at her. And when she stepped into the path of danger without flinching, without permission, without a single thought for what it would cost her, something happened that would unravel the entire order of the wolf world. His wolf chose her. Not the alpha's daughter. Not the beta with the bloodline. Not anyone they had prepared for or expected. The girl they had buried under 22 years of lies. And she was not what any of them thought she was. Subscribe. Comment. Share. Hit subscribe right now so this story finds you every single time a new chapter drops. Leave a comment below telling us what you think is going to happen. And if you know someone who lives for a wolf romance that does not play by the rules, share this with them immediately. This story is just getting started, and you do not want to be the person who found it late. Chapter 1. The girl they underestimated. She was born wrong. That was what they told her from the moment she could understand words. Born to the wrong family, carrying the wrong rank, breathing the wrong air in a world that had already decided she did not belong in it. Seraphina Cole was an omega in the Ironblood Pack, and if you knew anything about the Ironblood Pack, you already knew what that meant. It meant she woke before dawn to light the fires in the packhouse kitchen while everyone else slept. It meant she carried water buckets up 3 flights of stairs until the muscles in her arms stopped burning and simply went numb. It meant she absorbed every cruel word, every dismissive glance, every plate of food shoved toward her at the edge of the table like she was something barely tolerated and never truly welcomed. But here is what they never told you about Seraphina Cole. She had survived every single day of it. Not just survived. She had memorized the survival. She had turned it into something sharp and internal, a quiet kind of armor that nobody could see because it lived beneath her skin rather than on top of it. Her amber eyes, the color of late afternoon sunlight trapped in honey, missed nothing. Her hands, calloused and capable, moved through the world with a precision that came from years of learning to be invisible while still being useful. And her wolf, the part of her that every other pack member dismissed as weak and underdeveloped, had been doing something in the dark and quiet of her chest that nobody had bothered to notice. It had been growing. On the morning everything changed, Seraphina was 22 years old. The Ironblood Pack territory stretched across the northern edge of the Silver Pine Mountains, a brutal and beautiful landscape that rewarded strength and punished anything it perceived as softness. The pack house was an enormous stone structure, all iron gates and cold corridors and windows that let in light but never warmth. She was in the east courtyard when she heard the motorcycles. 3 of them, moving through the main gate with the kind of unhurried confidence that told you immediately these were not visitors who needed permission. The pack members who had been milling around stiffened almost as one. Seraphina kept her hands moving, sorting through the fresh herbs she had gathered from the garden, but her amber eyes tracked the movement without appearing to. She knew who they were before she saw the insignia on the lead rider's jacket. Blackstone Pack. The name moved through the gathered wolves like a current of electricity. The Blackstone Pack was the most powerful wolf community in the entire Northern Territory, over 800 wolves spread across 4 mountain ranges. Their alpha, Caspian Blackstone, was the kind of man that other alphas spoke about in careful, measured tones even when they were certain he could not hear them. He was the last thing Seraphina needed to see that morning. He was also the first thing that made her wolf go completely and terrifyingly still since the day she was born. Caspian Blackstone dismounted with the fluid economy of someone who had never once been uncertain about where he was standing or why. He was tall, considerably taller than anyone in the Ironblood Pack, with the kind of build that suggested power that had been tested and refined through actual use. His hair was black as deep water, swept back from a face that was angular and stern and, if Seraphina was honest with herself, almost dangerously beautiful. His eyes swept across the courtyard with the automatic survey of a man who always assessed his environment first, and they were the precise gray of storm clouds 2 hours before they broke open. Pack Alpha Donovan Hale walked out of the pack house with his chest puffed, his smile stretched into the particular shape of a man trying to appear powerful in front of someone far more powerful. He was in his mid-50s, broad and gray-templed, possessed of the deep conviction that his cruelties were simply good management. Seraphina turned away from the scene and focused on her herbs. 6 minutes later, something happened that made every instinct in her body go rigid. One of Caspian's betas had moved toward a younger pack member, a boy of maybe 16 named Eli, who had always been kind to Seraphina in the small harmless ways that young wolves are occasionally kind to omegas. Eli had accidentally dropped a tray of water glasses directly in the path of Caspian's boots. Eli had gone white. Donovan Hale was already moving toward the boy, with that particular expression Seraphina recognized from years of being on the receiving end of it. She moved before she decided to move. It was muscle memory and something older than muscle memory combined. She was between Eli and Donovan before she had consciously authorized her body to close the distance. She looked directly at Donovan Hale with her herbs still in her hands and her amber eyes completely steady and said, quietly enough that only those nearby could hear, that Eli was doing a task she had assigned him and the error was hers, not his. The courtyard went quiet in a new way. Donovan stared at her with the particular fury of a man who had been interrupted in front of an audience he cared about impressing. Seraphina did not look away. She had done this before in private. Never in front of visitors. Never in front of an alpha from another pack. She was aware of the calculation her body was making, understood that this could go very badly for her in ways that would outlast the morning. But Eli was 16 and shaking, and something in Seraphina simply would not move out of the way. Then she felt it. Not felt it like weather or proximity. Felt it the way her wolf felt it, a pulse of something that moved up her spine and settled at the base of her skull like a warm hand pressed there, steady and deliberate and unmistakably interested. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Donovan and her face calm. But she knew, with the certainty that comes not from logic, but from whatever deeper mechanism makes wolves what they are, that Caspian Blackstone was looking at her. Donovan stepped back, redirecting his attention to his guests with a laugh that was meant to communicate this had been nothing. Seraphina bent down, helped Eli gather the broken glass, pressed his trembling hands briefly between hers, told him quietly to go to the kitchen and stay there, and then straightened and walked back toward the herb garden. She was 10 feet from the gate when she heard his voice for the first time. Low and deliberate and carrying the way a voice carries when it is accustomed to being heard without being raised. He said her name. Not Omega. Not girl. Not the dozen dismissive titles that had served as her identity for 22 years. He said Seraphina, and he said it like he had already known it before he asked anyone what it was. She stopped walking. She took exactly one breath, pressed it down into her chest where her wolf was doing that terrifyingly still thing again, and then she turned. Caspian Blackstone was 5 feet away. He was looking at her with those storm cloud eyes in a way that made Seraphina understand, for the first time in her life, what it meant when older wolves talked about the mate bond like it was something that arrived rather than something you chose. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, simply and directly, that she had more courage than anyone else in this courtyard. Seraphina looked back at him and said, with the same quietness she used for everything, that courage was not the right word. That she had simply been unable to do otherwise. Something moved across his face. Quick and deep and almost unguarded. He said he wanted to speak with her before his business with the Ironblood Pack was concluded. And Seraphina, who had spent 22 years being told she was worth nothing and had spent all of those years quietly, privately, absolutely refusing to believe it, looked at the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territory and said that she would be in the garden if he was looking for her. Then she walked away. Behind her, she heard one of his betas exhale sharply, the sound of someone who had witnessed something unexpected. And in her chest, pressed close and warm against her ribs, her wolf finally moved. Not in fear. Not in submission. In recognition. If this story has your heart racing, do not stop here. Subscribe so you never miss a chapter. Leave a comment and tell us what you think of Seraphina. Share this story with someone who loves a wolf romance that hits differently. Every like, every share, every comment keeps this story alive. Chapter 2. What the Bond Does Not Ask Permission For. Donovan Hale had been running the Ironblood Pack for 23 years and had developed an almost sophisticated ability to pretend that problems did not exist when acknowledging them was inconvenient. Seraphina, standing in his study 2 hours after the courtyard incident, watching him pace behind his enormous oak desk, could see him applying this ability to the current situation and failing with a comprehensiveness that might have been satisfying under different circumstances. The current situation was this. Caspian Blackstone had requested a private meeting with the pack's lowest-ranking Omega before conducting his formal business. This was not a request that came with much negotiating room. When the Alpha of the Blackstone pack made a request, it moved through wolf politics less like a question and more like a stone dropped through thin ice. Donovan was telling her, through clenched teeth, that she was to be on her absolute best behavior. That she was to answer what was asked and nothing more. That she was to remember her rank and her place and the fact that she represented the Ironblood Pack whether she deserved to or not. Seraphina listened with the patience she had developed over 22 years of listening to variations on the same theme. When he was finished, she said yes, Alpha, and left the study. She was not nervous the way Donovan wanted her to be nervous. She was something else, a state of heightened alertness that felt less like fear and more like the moment before something significant, when the world was still holding its breath. Caspian was waiting in the smaller meeting room off the main corridor. He had dismissed his betas, which told Seraphina something about his read of the situation. He was standing at the window when she entered and turned when he heard the door, and the same thing happened that had happened in the courtyard, that settling sensation at the base of her skull. Her wolf pressing forward in her chest like it was trying to get closer to something it recognized. She sat in the chair across the small table without waiting to be invited. He noticed that. She saw him notice it, saw the small shift in his expression that was not displeasure. He sat as well and looked at her directly in a way that was not aggressive, but entirely unapologetic, the gaze of someone who had decided that looking at something clearly was simply the right approach. He said he was going to ask her something direct, and he would rather she answered directly in return than gave him the answer she thought he expected. Seraphina said that was a reasonable preference. He needed to know how long she had been in the Ironblood Pack and whether she had ever been tested for rank classification beyond the initial assessment. Something moved through her chest. Not her wolf this time, but something more human and more complicated. She told him the truth. That she had been assigned Omega at birth, as was custom. That the initial assessment had been conducted by Donovan Hale himself. That no secondary assessment had ever been performed. Caspian was quiet for a moment in the specific way of someone holding something carefully. He told her that what she had done in the courtyard was not an Omega behavior pattern. That he had assessed thousands of wolves across 2 decades of pack leadership. That the movement, the positioning, the particular frequency of authority she had projected when she inserted herself between the boy and the alpha had looked like an alpha protecting a pack member. The room was very quiet. Seraphina said nothing because there was a great deal compressed into that silence and she was deciding how much of it to release. Then she told him that she had spent 22 years being whatever the pack needed her to be. That rank was not something she had ever been permitted to think about as a question rather than a settled fact. That she was aware her wolf did not behave according to Omega classification in her private experience of it, but that private experience was not something she had ever had an audience for. Caspian leaned forward slightly. He said her wolf was not small. And something broke open in Seraphina's chest that she had been keeping sealed for 22 years. Not visibly. She did not cry or shake. She simply sat very still and looked at this man who had just said out loud the thing she had known in the dark of herself for as long as she could remember, and she breathed through the enormous, complicated weight of being seen accurately after a lifetime of being misread on purpose. She said she knew. He said he did too. And then, because the bond was not interested in timing or propriety, his wolf reached toward hers in that deep subterranean way that had nothing to do with words or decision-making, and hers reached back, and both of them felt it land. The mate bond. Not a soft thing. Not a gentle dawning. It arrived like a key finding a lock it was made for, precise and certain, and accompanied by the kind of rightness that made every other configuration of the world suddenly seem slightly off by comparison. Caspian closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When he opened them, his expression had changed in a way that was profound and also, Seraphina thought, somewhat terrifying in its implications for the next several hours of her life. He said her name again, the way he had said it in the courtyard. She said she understood what had just happened. He said he needed to speak with Donovan Hale. She said that conversation was going to be extremely unpleasant. He said he was aware of that. She said she was not going to pretend it had not happened or agree to keep it quiet if that was something he was considering. He looked at her with those storm-cloud eyes, and something that was almost, but not quite a smile, moved across his face. He said that hiding it was not something he did. That if she was his mate, and the bond did not lie, then the Ironblood Pack was going to know it before nightfall. Seraphina sat with that for a moment. She said she had lived her entire life in this pack, being told she was nothing. That the announcement he was describing was going to be received by some of those people as an act of aggression against the established order. He said he was aware of that too. She said she needed him to understand that her agreement to this was not something he was entitled to assume simply because the bond had formed. That she was not in the habit of following anyone anywhere without understanding where she was being led. Caspian went very still. Then he said that was the most important thing anyone had said to him in a decade of leading a pack. He said he did not want her compliance. He wanted her partnership. That they were very different things, and he intended to spend whatever time she gave him making that distinction clear through his actions rather than his words. Seraphina looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, carefully and without theatrics, that she was listening. And in her chest, her wolf pressed warm against her ribs like an ember that had finally. Chapter 3. The Weight of Being Claimed. Donovan Hale did not take it well. This was not a surprise to anyone present, but the specific shape of his not taking it well had a quality Seraphina had not entirely anticipated, an unraveling that went beyond the personal and moved into the political, exposing layers of deliberate mismanagement that implicated him far more seriously than a simple emotional reaction would have. Caspian had requested the full leadership council of the Ironblood Pack be present. This was within his rights as a visiting alpha under Interpack Treaty Protocol, and Donovan could not refuse it without committing a diplomatic breach with consequences extending well beyond this afternoon. The council room held 7 people in addition to Seraphina and Caspian. Donovan's 3 senior betas, 2 elder wolves who served as pack memory keepers, the pack healer, a woman named Marin who was in her late 60s and had always looked at Seraphina with an expression that sat somewhere between guilt and helplessness, and a younger council member named Griffin who had never been specifically cruel to Seraphina but had never intervened either, which she had long ago categorized as its own category of failure. Caspian stood at the head of the table with the uncomplicated authority of someone who knew the room was already organized around him whether he worked for it or not. He had his betas positioned at the door, not threateningly, but present in a way that communicated the shape of available options. He told the room that a mate bond had formed between himself and Seraphina Cole, Omega of the Ironblood Pack, and that he was formally declaring this bond and requesting her release from Ironblood Pack membership in accordance with established transfer provisions. The room absorbed this. Donovan's face went through several colors in the space of 8 seconds. He said that was not possible. Caspian said he was curious which part Donovan found implausible. Donovan said that Seraphina was a low-ranking Omega with no particular standing and no value as a political match, implying clearly that a mate bond with her was either a mistake or a manipulation. Caspian said nothing for exactly long enough that the silence became its own statement. Then he said he would like to formally request, under Interpack Protocol, that a rank assessment be performed on Seraphina Cole. A proper assessment conducted by a neutral party. He said he found it interesting that no secondary assessment had ever been performed, given that several elements of her behavior were inconsistent with standard Omega classification. The pack healer, Marin, went the color of old ash. And Seraphina understood, in the specific crystalline way that things you have always half known become fully known, that Marin had not merely been unable to help her over the years. Marin had known something. Seraphina did not look at her. She looked at Donovan. She said, quietly and clearly enough to be heard by everyone in the room, that she would like to know the results of her birth assessment. The original documentation. She said she was entitled to her own pack records under the same interpack protocol Caspian had referenced. Donovan said those records were pack property. Caspian said he was incorrect and cited the specific treaty article. The room was very, very quiet. Marin spoke then. Her voice was unsteady, but she spoke. She said that Seraphina's birth assessment had not been documented accurately. That the initial assessment had indicated an anomalous result, not Omega, not Beta, something that did not fit the standard categories cleanly, and that Donovan had instructed her to record it as Omega and discuss it with no one. She said she had followed that instruction for 22 years. She said she was sorry. The council room sat in its silence. Seraphina breathed through the enormity of it. 22 years of cold corridors and before-dawn labor and absorbed cruelties, and the relentless daily work of surviving a life that had been built on a deliberate lie. Her wolf moved in her chest. Not toward fury, though fury was present. Toward something larger and more consuming and ultimately more powerful than fury. Toward the specific kind of clarity that comes when you finally, completely understand the full shape of what you have survived. She looked at Donovan Hale with her amber eyes, and she let him see it. All of it. Everything she had been carrying that had been his to carry by rights, and had been redirected onto her through the mechanism of his choice. He held her gaze for 3 seconds before he looked away. Caspian, beside her, placed his hand on the table between them. Not on her hand. Not claiming contact she had not offered. Just near her, present in the way that said he was there and she was not alone, and she could decide how to use that presence or not use it, and either choice would be respected. She put her hand over his. She felt the bond hum between them, deep and warm and absolutely certain. Caspian addressed the council. He said he was initiating a formal interpack inquiry into the administrative practices of the Ironblood Pack leadership, which would be conducted under the authority of the Blackstone Pack as the regional governing body. He said this inquiry would begin immediately. He said Seraphina Cole would be accompanying him when he left today, as his mate and as a primary subject of the inquiry, and that any attempt to prevent her departure would be considered an act of aggression against the Blackstone Pack. He said this without raising his voice. He said it the way a mountain exists. Without apology. Without negotiation. Simply, completely, and with no available angle from which to argue with it. Donovan Hale sat down in his chair like something had been removed from his skeleton. And Seraphina, who had woken up that morning at 5:45 to light the kitchen fires of a house that had never been her home, looked around the council room at the pack she was leaving and understood that she was not leaving with nothing. She was leaving with everything she had built inside herself during 22 years of carrying what should never have been hers to carry. She rose from the table. She walked out of the council room. Caspian was 1 step behind her. In the corridor, away from the room, she stopped walking and stood still for a moment with her eyes closed and breathed 4 slow deliberate breaths while everything inside her reorganized itself around what had just happened. Caspian waited. He did not fill the silence. Did not ask if she was all right. Did not perform concern in any of the ways she had learned to distrust. He simply stood nearby and let her have the moment she needed. When she opened her eyes, she said she needed to go to her room and collect what was hers. He said he would wait. She said it would not take long because she did not have much. Something moved across his face. Brief and almost hidden. He said that was going to change. Seraphina looked at him with her amber eyes and the specific expression of someone who has learned to be careful about hope. Then she said she would hold him to that. She came back in 11 minutes with a bag that was not large. And she walked out of the Ironblood Pack gates with the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territory, and the gates closed behind her, and she did not look back. If this story has your heart racing, subscribe so you never miss a chapter. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Chapter 4. Learning to be unmissed. The Blackstone Pack territory was 3 hours from the Ironblood Pack by road, and Seraphina spent the first hour looking out the window at the mountains she had grown up inside and feeling the specific disorientation of someone whose context has changed so rapidly that the internal landscape has not yet caught up. Caspian drove. His betas followed in the second vehicle. He had said little since they left, which she was grateful for. The silence was comfortable in a way she was still processing, because comfortable silence required a certain kind of safety, and safety was something Seraphina had always had to construct at significant personal cost rather than simply inhabit. She asked him, eventually, what his pack was going to make of all this. He said she meant what were they going to make of him arriving home with a mate he had not had when he left that morning. She said yes, that was what she meant. He said his pack would respond to how he responded. That if he treated her arrival as a significant and celebrated thing, they would follow that lead. That no one in the Blackstone Pack was going to make her feel like she had to earn a place she already held by right of the bond. She said she was not accustomed to things she did not have to earn. He said she would learn. She looked at him. He said it with the ease of someone stating something they simply believed to be true, without the weight of an argument behind it, without the performance of trying to convince her. It was the cadence of a fact he was presenting for her consideration rather than a promise he needed her to validate. She turned back to the window. She said, to the mountains and the glass, that she was going to need time. That the bond was real and she felt it and was not in the business of pretending otherwise, but that she was also a person who had spent 22 years developing a very specific and finely calibrated relationship with her own judgment. And that relationship was not something she was willing to set aside simply because the circumstances had changed dramatically. Caspian said he would not ask her to. She said some days she was going to be difficult. He said he imagined so. He said he was also going to be difficult on some days, and they were probably going to disagree about things, and he was not interested in a partnership that resolved conflict by flattening it. She said that was a strange thing for an alpha to say. He said she had a very specific idea of what an alpha was. She said she had a 20-year dataset. He said that dataset had been collected in one pack run by one man who was a poor example of the category. She was quiet. She said he was not wrong. He said he knew. And something shifted between them. Small, but real. The bond was underneath it all like a current, but this was something different. Something being constructed in real time out of the actual material of who they were separately and how those things might eventually fit together into something neither of them had had before. When they reached the Blackstone territory, the mountains opened up differently, wider and lower on one side, with a valley that caught the late afternoon light and held it in a way that made the whole landscape look lit from within. The pack house was large and clearly functional, but also surrounded by things that indicated life rather than simply habitation. Gardens. A training ground. Buildings that looked like they served specific and valued purposes. Wolves moving between structures with the ease of people who felt genuinely at home. She said it was larger than she expected. He said 843 wolves was a genuine community, not simply a power structure. She said that distinction mattered to him. He said it was the only distinction that mattered. He pulled through the main gate. The wolves who saw the vehicle coming either raised a hand in greeting or came to brief alert in the way of pack members clocking an alpha's return. Several of them looked at the passenger seat with the attention of people noticing something new, but none of them looked hostile. Most of them simply looked curious in the uncomplicated way of communities that were not afraid of new information. Seraphina kept her spine straight and her amber eyes open. She was not going to perform smallness in a new place just because that was what she had learned to perform in the old one. Caspian parked and came around to her door, and she was already out before he reached it, which made one corner of his mouth move in what she was beginning to recognize as the closest he got to an unreserved smile. A woman came out of the pack house at a pace that indicated she had been watching for the vehicle. She was in her late 40s, silver-streaked black hair, a face that wore its authority lightly in the way of someone who had never needed to perform it. She looked between Caspian and Seraphina with the expression of someone already processing something significant. Caspian said this was Vera, his head beta, and the person who actually kept the pack functioning. Vera looked at Seraphina. Seraphina looked back. Vera said she could feel the bond from where she was standing, and she had about 47 questions, but they could wait until after Seraphina had eaten and had somewhere to sit down. Seraphina said that was a more gracious reception than she had been anticipating. Vera looked at Caspian and said, with the warmth of someone genuinely fond and genuinely allowed to express that she liked this one. Caspian said he was aware. And Seraphina, standing in the late afternoon light of the Blackstone territory with the mountains around her, and the bond warm in her chest, and the strange enormous feeling of standing somewhere she might actually be allowed to become fully herself, felt something happen in her throat that she pressed firmly back down because this was not the moment for it. But she noted it. She filed it. She would find a moment for it later, privately, when she could allow herself the full weight of what it meant to finally be somewhere that did not require her to be less than she was. Vera put a hand briefly on Seraphina's arm as they walked toward the packhouse door, the light gesture of someone who understood what a significant arrival felt like and wanted to mark it without overwhelming it. She said, "Welcome to Blackstone." She said they had been waiting, even though they had not known it yet. And Seraphina walked through the door of the packhouse that was going to become her home and felt her wolf settle in her chest for the first time in 22 years with the deep, uncomplicated stillness of something that had finally arrived where it was going. Chapter 5. The Wolf They Built Together. 90 days later, the Blackstone packhouse had reorganized itself around Seraphina Cole in the quiet, organic way of communities that accept someone fully and then simply proceed as though that acceptance was always the plan. She had not made it easy. She wanted to be honest about that, to herself and to Caspian, who had experienced the full range of what it meant to be in the process of earning the trust of someone who had very good reasons for being careful with theirs. There had been 3 significant disagreements in the first month, one of them serious enough that Seraphina had removed herself from a council meeting to stand outside in the cold air for 20 minutes, deciding whether she was capable of this, whether the accumulated weight of her history was too much to remodel into something that could function inside a genuine partnership. She had gone back inside, not because the disagreement was resolved. It was resolved 2 days later, after both of them had said hard and accurate things and listened to hard and accurate things in return. It was resolved because they were both committed to a version of this that did not require one person to disappear for the other to feel safe. Her rank assessment, conducted by a specialist brought in from a neutral territory, had taken 3 days and produced results that silenced the remaining skeptics in both her history and her present. The specialist had used the word anomalous and then immediately said that was not adequate, that Seraphina's wolf presented a classification that predated the current 4-tier system, something older and less common. The word she finally settled on was sovereign, a designation that existed in the oldest wolf texts as a category distinct from alpha in kind rather than simply degree. Associated historically with wolves whose function was not the dominance of a pack, but the integrity of a pack's foundation. Wolves, the text said, that packs were built around rather than built by. Caspian had read the full assessment report in his office with Seraphina sitting across from him, and when he looked up he said he was not surprised. She said she was. He said he was not, because from the moment she had stepped between Eli and a punishment that was not warranted, she had not been operating from her own survival calculus. She had been operating from something that did not factor her own position into the equation at all. That was not what an Omega did. It was not even exactly what an Alpha did. It was something older and more intrinsic. She said she had thought it was a flaw. He said it was the opposite of a flaw. On the 61st day, Seraphina had asked to sit in on the pack council meetings, not as Caspian's mate making an entitled claim to a seat at the table. As a pack member requesting access to community governance on the basis of genuine interest and offered contribution. Vera had supported the request before Caspian could even finish reading it. By the 75th day, she was not sitting in. She was contributing. Her contributions had a quality the council had not experienced before, a particular way of identifying the structural elements of problems rather than their surface presentations, which meant that solutions she proposed had a longevity that other solutions often lacked because they addressed the actual architecture of the issue rather than its visible symptoms. Caspian watched this with the specific satisfaction of someone who has always known a thing was true and finds it verified not through argument, but through evidence accumulating naturally over time. He also watched her with the less analytical and considerably more personal satisfaction of someone who is very deeply in love with someone who is also, incrementally and on her own terms, finding her way toward the same. It was not arrived at quickly. Seraphina did not do things quickly when they mattered. She moved toward loving him the way she moved toward most things of significance, with her amber eyes open and her wolf attentive and her full intelligence applied to the question of whether this was real and whether it would hold. It held. On the 90th day, he asked her to walk with him to the northern ridge at the edge of Blackstone territory, the place where the mountains came closest to the valley, and you could see the full sweep of the pack's land laid out in both directions with the sky enormous above it. He had told her 2 months ago that this was where his father had brought him as a boy to explain what the alpha role actually was. Not power. Not authority. The responsibility of being the person that the wolves you led could orient around, could return to, could trust to still be standing in the same place when the world moved uncomfortably. She had remembered that. He stood at the ridge and looked out over the territory and said that he had something to ask her, and he needed her to answer him the way she answered everything, meaning directly and honestly and without managing his feelings at the expense of her truth. She said she was listening. He said he was asking her to stay. Not because of the bond, which had already ensured that leaving would cost both of them something real. Not because the pack needed her, though they did and they knew it. But because he was asking her, Caspian, who had run a pack of 800 wolves for a decade and had never once in that time found anyone he wanted to stand on this ridge with, was asking Seraphina, who had survived 22 years of being told she was worth nothing by being privately certain that was wrong, to stay because he wanted her beside him for every remaining thing. He was not on his knees. That was not how either of them operated. He was standing next to her looking out at the same landscape, two people at the edge of something large, asking the question with the same directness she had insisted on from the beginning. She was quiet for a moment, not processing whether to say yes. She had known the answer to that question for some time. She was quiet because the weight of it deserved a moment, because 22 years of being told she was worth nothing and this single 90-day chapter of discovering with increasing certainty that she was worth a very great deal were both present in her simultaneously, and she was not going to rush past that without honoring what it had cost to get here. Then she said yes. She said it once, clearly and without qualification. And Caspian turned to look at her with those storm cloud eyes, and she looked back with her amber ones, and the bond between them, which had always felt like a current underneath everything, rose for a moment to the surface and showed itself fully, and they both let it. She said she had one more thing to say. He said he was listening. She said she had spent 22 years surviving. That she was done surviving. That what she intended to do now, here in this territory with this pack and with him, was live. Not perform it, not produce evidence of it for anyone's benefit, not hold it lightly so it could not be taken away. Live it fully, with the whole wolf she had always been, and had finally been given the context to become. He said that was what he wanted too. She said she knew. She said she had known for a while. And the northern wind came down off the mountain and moved through both of them, and in Seraphina's chest her wolf stood up fully for the first time in her life, not pressed against her ribs in cautious hope, not carefully still in the dark, but present and certain and luminous with the recognition of a creature that had finally, completely, arrived in the life it was made for. They stood on the ridge together until the light changed. And then they walked home. That is Chapter 5 of Shattered Omega. If Seraphina's story moved you, made you hold your breath, made you want to stand on that ridge with her, then you already know what to do. Subscribe so you are always first when the next story drops. Leave a comment and tell us which moment hit you hardest. Was it the courtyard, the council room, or the ridge? Share this story with every person you know who deserves a wolf romance that does not play small. Like, comment, share, subscribe.